In the previous Soul Eater novel video, I covered Chapter 3, which covered the events of Magician's Island from Tyr's arrival until he returned to Kraze with the astral predications. In Chapter 3, Tyr's encounter with Luke played out differently than it did in the game, and so did his meeting with Kraze when he returned, where Kraze ordered them to Rockland to investigate the missing tax money. It also included a brand new scene involving Leknot and Luke. In this video, I'll be covering Chapter 4. Chapter 4 covers the events of Tyr and his group arriving in Rockland, which doesn't sound like a whole lot considering you're only there for a total of about 2 minutes in the game, but the events in Rockland play out very differently in the novel. Despite this being a relatively short chapter in the book, it's going to be a much longer video than the previous chapters because the way the novel handles Rockland is like a whole new scenario, and I don't think I'll do it justice unless I'm thorough. And as always, I'll be doing no editing on these videos covering the novels, so treat them as an audio experience. If a picture appears in the book, I'll put it up on screen while talking about that scene, but aside from that, the video will be strictly audio with the cover of the novel. Chapter 4. Rockland. The day after delivering the astral predications to Kraze, Tyr and the others prepared for their journey to Rockland. Kraze begrudgingly lent them 5 horses, and they departed Gregminster to fulfill their mission. Because they were blessed with clear weather and made good progress on the road, they were able to see Rockland on the distant horizon on the evening of the second day, but they were growing tired since they were constantly on horseback, the only exception being when they camped. Riding his horse at the head of the party, Pon stretched and turned back to Tyr. He told him that Rockland is finally in sight, that his ass hurts like hell from riding the horse for the last 2 days, and when they get to Rockland he just wants to crash at an inn. Cleo walked her horse beside Pon, and with her exhaustion showing, she muttered, "Amen to that." She then criticised Kraze for forcing them on a mission where they can't even take a proper shower and for not knowing how to treat a lady. From behind, they heard Gremio say, "Not to burst your bubble, but..." Gremio then pushed his horse forward and rode alongside Pon and Cleo. He told them that they'll be paying their own way from here on out, as the funds they received from Kraze barely covered the cost of preparing for the journey. Pon's eyes bulged in outrage as he called Kraze a bastard for sending them on this long-ass journey with chump change. Gremio commented that the government isn't doing well financially right now, and he's heard that Rockland isn't the only town that hasn't paid its taxes. With a puzzled look on his face, Tyr muttered he wonders why, as he hadn't heard of any big disasters or droughts this year. He then asked there must be some reason they're not paying. Their conversation was interrupted when Ted glanced towards Rockland and said, "What the..." The group all heard the shock in Ted's voice and turned to look at Rockland, where they saw a thin black column of smoke rising from the streets. Tyr shouted out that it's a fire and they should go check it out as he whipped his horse and galloped off. The others followed after, and as they got closer to Rockland they could see with painful clarity the flames wavering between buildings and the smoke growing thicker. Tyr entered the town at a lively pace but reined in his horse as he was greeted by a strange sight. Though smoke continued to rise from the centre of the town, strong men and young boys gathered in the lanes with no apparent intention to douse the blaze. As if that weren't enough, some were even pointing to the growing flames and laughing. Uncomprehending, Tyr turned to the 4 behind him and asked them what the heck's going on. Pon pulled his claws out of his leather bag stored at his horse's side and said he doesn't know about the people on the streets, but Mount Seifu lies to the east of this town. Tyr responded and asked if those shouts they've been hearing are, but before he could finish asking, Pon answered and told him the Mount Seifu Bandits. Cleo responded that it's a distinct possibility as she drew the daggers at her waist and told Tyr that according to rumours, the bandits see the Empire as an enemy. Gremio had a worried look on his face and drew closer to Tyr on his horse as he called out, "Young master." Everyone waited for Tyr to speak. Tyr quietly closed his eyes to think. He had swung his staff at human opponents during practice, but this would be his first time using his staff in combat. He had confidence in his skills, but he couldn't help but feel afraid as he was worried for everyone else, but he was a member of the Imperial Guard, so just like his father, it was his duty to protect the Empire. He gripped his staff tightly and raised his head as he said to the others they have to do something. Pon replied that's right and said they should teach them what it means to be an Imperial Guard. Tightly squeezing the trembling horse with his legs, Tyr swung his staff overhead and took aim. The first bandit in front of Tyr was blown backwards and collapsed. It was so sudden that Tir didn't understand what had happened, but comprehension dawned when Cleo called out from behind, telling him to leave the little ones to her. Then an arrow flew from behind Tir and pierced one of the bandits as Ted called out he's here too. Slipping past the bandits, now victims to daggers and arrows, Tir and Pan ran around looking for the leader. Gripping his staff in his hand, Tir was filled with a strength that hadn't been there before. Leaping over the fallen soldiers, sweeping aside the bandits who gushed forth, he and Pan went around and cut into the front of the mansion. Then they came across two bandits who seemed like the leaders. They had just tied up two men and were about to run away on horseback. Pan shouted out that's them as 5 or 6 mounted bandits brandishing curved blades leapt out in front of them. One after the other, bandits who were the very picture of ruffians came rushing at them. Some wore eye patches and others had tattoos all over their arms. Ted let out a laugh and commented how exciting this is. Tir began to gallop, leading the way, weaving through the gaps between the simple stone houses. Pan and Cleo followed right on his heels, with Ted and Gremio a little behind them. They came out onto the main road paved with stone and spurred their horses towards the rising smoke. Before long, they arrived at the mansion wreathed in smoke. Injured soldiers littered the ground and there were bandits cheerfully laughing nearby carrying gold and silver. Pan shouted at Tir to aim for their boss, that if they can take the boss down then the small fries will be the only ones left. Perhaps hearing the sound of their horses' hooves clacking on the flagstones, the joyful shouting nearby abruptly stopped. 10 or so bandits turned around to face them, each one brandishing a weapon, and turned their piercing glares on Tir. He didn't care what weapons they had in hand, but the minute Tir sensed the bandits' bloodlust, fear gripped his heart. He gritted his teeth with all his strength and glared at the bandits, giving them a taste of their own bloodlust. Gremio eventually caught up with them and it turned into a free-for-all fight with the bandits. Pan, who was far stronger on foot than on horseback, griped this bites and jumped from his horse and began stabbing and kicking the bandits. He ordered Gremio to go with the young master. Gremio and Tir slipped away from the free-for-all and rode their horses towards the men who looked like the leaders. Tir raised his voice over the resounding noise of the horses' hooves and called out to the two men who looked like the leaders and asked them if they're the Mount Seifu Bandits. The two bandits turned to stare at Tir in surprise. One had a squarish face, a burly beard and mustache, and unlike the other bandits, wore a green bandana. His large frame wrapped in a pelt and the huge axe he carried at his back lent him the air of a mountain giant. The other one was slender, had long hair, and was dressed like one of those ninjas Tir had read about before. He didn't appear to be holding a weapon, but it may have been concealed. First, the giant bandit turned around his horse and stared straight at Tir. Then, as if he had thought of something, he turned and whispered to his slender companion. They exchanged looks and grinned. Tir was certain they saw him as a child, and he wasn't going to let this chance pass. He dug his heels into the horse's sides and flew towards them. Tir brought his staff crashing down, smack in the middle of the big man's forehead. He slipped by as the giant fell from his horse without having time to even draw his axe. The man cried out, "Arr, you bastard!" Even though the giant bandit managed to stand, he was shaky and unsteady on his feet. Gremio kept the thin one engaged, not giving him any time to draw a weapon. Tir turned his horse, and just as he was about to attack again, a voice called out "Young Master," and another asked Tir if he was okay. Holding her throwing knives between her fingers, Cleo appeared around the corner of the mansion. Behind her came Ted with an arrow nocked, and a little later Pan arrived with his breastplate splattered with blood. Holding his forehead, the giant bandit looked up at Tir and commented, "Reinforcements?" The bandit, who called himself Varkas, spat over his shoulder and said to Tir that this isn't the last time he's seen of Varkas of the Whirlwind Axe. He then told him he better be ready the next time they meet as he jumped on his horse and galloped away east with his thin companion in a cloud of dust. Tir looked down at the two men who were tied up and asked them if they're alright. Tir then jumped down from his horse and untied the rope binding the two captured men. One was a thin man wearing a gaudy velvet jacket. The other was a round-faced man with a small mustache, and his plump body was garbed in red. The men rubbed the marks left by the ropes on their arms for some time, but eventually, perhaps when the feeling of being freed settled in, they let out enormous sighs of relief. It was only then that Tir began to feel that the battle was over. The wind was still whipping the mansion fire into an intense blaze, but the bandits had completely vanished from the town and the wounded soldiers were receiving medical aid. With a sigh, the man wearing the velvet jacket said he thought he was going to die. The mustache man was still trembling, but eventually calmed down and addressed Tir in an odd voice. He let out a humph and commented they possessed some skill, then asked them who they are. Unable to comprehend the man's question, Tir looked at him and said, "Huh?" The mustache man then asked them if they belong to the Imperial Army or if they're just passing travellers. Climbing down from his horse, Gremio responded that they're members of the Imperial Army. A sly grin spread across the man's face as he asked them what unit they belonged to. Gremio responded they belonged to the Imperial Guard and they were ordered to come here by Commander Craze too. The mustache man's round face became flooded with rage and he cut Gremio off. He shouted at the group, asking them where the devil you scumbags have been lollygagging. He said to them when they're told to hurry, they hurry, and if they waited any longer, he would have been tortured to death by those repulsive bandits. Tir and the rest were at a loss for words. To be called scumbags and scalded by some stranger they'd just risked their lives fighting off bandits to save was ridiculous. Speaking for everyone, Gremio spoke up and told the man to say what he will, but they don't even know who he is. The mustache man told Gremio to shut up, be quiet and not to talk back to him. After his hysteric ranting drowned out Gremio's words, he grinned nefariously and said to the man in the jacket, "See Grady, it was the troops I called in that fought off the bandits." Grady responded that he's filled with awe at Kanan's foresight and told him he has his endless gratitude. And with that, everything finally clicked into place. The two men who the bandits had almost run off with were the Governor Grady and the aide Kanan that Craze had told them of. But something still wasn't right. Kanan had been incommunicado and was now throwing his weight around to claim credit for driving away the bandits. Then Kanan declared to the astonished group that since you scum did a good job, he'll forgive them for being late, so they better be grateful. Pan gritted his teeth behind Tir. Cleo warned Pan in a whisper to stop, that Kanan's bragging means nothing, so just let it go. Pan let out an ugh in disgust and kept quiet. Tir also quelled his frustration by repeating Cleo's words over and over in his head. Grady then spoke up and said to the group that he expected no less from Kanan's subordinates, that he's stunned from their ability and he'd never seen such a brilliant battle before. Grady then stepped forward without warning and turned his flattery towards Tir. Tir smiled a little as he responded they were just doing their duty as Imperial Guards, but his smile vanished when Kanan cut in from the sidelines and corrected him by saying, "Don't you mean you were just following Lord Kanan's orders?" Tir reluctantly responded, "Yes sir, we were just following Lord Kanan's orders." Grady turned to Kanan. It's understandable that Grady, who is just the governor of an insignificant town like Rockland, would act subservient to someone like Kanan, who is the vice commander of the Imperial Guard, but the amount that Grady sucked up to Kanan was still exceptional. Rubbing his hands together, Grady told Kanan that the military prowess of his unit must be well known throughout the Empire. He then begged Kanan for a kindness. The Kanan who had been trembling in terror not long ago had vanished, and with a sneer he might have learned from Craze, he said to Grady that he's unstoppable now that his unit has arrived. He then asked Grady what the favour is, but told him that this is no place to discuss such matters and suggested they go to the inn as the mansion had been set on fire. Pulling their horses, Tir and the others followed Grady and Kanan into the smoke-filled town. After a short while, they finally ran into the soldiers who had regained control of the town. Gesturing to the remains of the mansion with a jerk of his chin, Grady told the soldiers to put out the fires and tomorrow they're to begin repairs on the mansion, and they can work the townspeople as hard as need be, but reminded them not to allow anyone near the storehouse, as that's where he's keeping all of the taxes he needs to pay the Empire. The soldiers responded yes sir and dispersed. The sounds of grief spread across the town as the voices of men resisting, the shouts of women and the cries of children could be heard. The soldiers, while brandishing their weapons, began herding the townspeople together. Tir couldn't take it anymore. He asked Grady why they're using the townspeople when they have soldiers at their disposal. Kanan answered with a humph and told Tir that was a stupid question. He then said that making soldiers work is a waste of supplies and empties their bellies, which means it costs money, but working the townspeople hard is fun and it doesn't cost them a thing. Grady laughed and told Kanan he hit the nail on the head. He then announced that they'd arrived at the inn, and without even announcing himself to the owner, he barged right in. They entered the small dining room of the inn where there were only 6 simple tables set up. Grady sat in a chair that had lost its varnish long ago, and Kanan sat across from him in a chair that didn't look like it could hold his weight. The chair's protesting squeaks echoed painfully in an otherwise empty room. Peering around at everyone's faces, Grady began speaking. He said to everyone, as they're now aware, the Mount Seifu Bandits often attack Rockland, and thanks to them, the townsfolk can't sleep at night and the soldiers are exhausted. Gremio replied that is a problem, and then informed Grady that they were ordered to come here by Commander Craze to investigate why Rockland hasn't paid its taxes this year. With a troubled look on his face, Grady responded they haven't been able to pay taxes this year because the bandits stole the tax money as soon as he collected it. With a puzzled expression, Ted cut in and reminded Grady of his words just moments ago that he told the soldiers he was keeping the taxes in the storehouse. Cleo then asked if that's where the bandits got the goods and money they were carrying away. Grady grew flustered and began stuttering as he replied that there is money in the storehouse, it's just not enough, and as much as he begs, there's no more money to get from the townspeople. He then told the group that he wants the bandits wiped out so he can finally pay the taxes he owes. Kanan's expression turned sour as he humphed and muttered to himself. He couldn't reply to Grady's request straight away, being the man who trembled in fear when captured by the bandits only moments ago. Grady began begging and pleading with Kanan. He then smiled and whispered something into Kanan's ear, and Kanan's face brightened instantly. Consider it done, Grady. Kanan thumped his own chest as if he'd offered to do the deed himself. He told Grady that since his unit is here, they'd love to catch the bandits and they'll head out first thing tomorrow morning. Kanan then turned to look at Tir and the others as he asked them, "Isn't that right, scum?" Tir was forced to answer, "Yes, sir." Grady then commented in satisfaction as he told Tir the bandits are wounded, so they shouldn't be able to move or put up much of a fight. He then told the group to head straight to Mount Seifu in the morning after they find a guide. Tir was again forced to answer, "Yes, sir." Tir and his group left the dining hall with heavy hearts and decided to sort out lodging before discussing matters. Gremio returned to the dining hall to negotiate with Kanan to cover their lodging, but Kanan's only reply was a snort. The group would have to pay their own lodging fees. They were so weary they ought to take any form of rest they could get. The night was growing late, and even though eating the famous Rockland Botan Nabe, a wild boar hot pot, the five retired to their rooms in silence. As the night grew later, so did the feeling that, though there were things they wanted to say, they couldn't say them now. Tir had climbed into bed, but he couldn't get the events of the day out of his head. He called to Ted, who was under the covers in the bed next to his. It seemed like Ted couldn't sleep either, and he responded by asking what's up. Tir asked him what he thinks of Rockland. He doesn't want to believe what they've seen here, but Ted responded that he feels the same way, and he thinks Grady and Kanan are suspicious. Ted then sat up and pushed his blanket aside as he said to Tir there's something he wants to tell him before it's too late. Tir sat up in response. Ted didn't know where to start with what he wanted to say. He stuttered as he said, "The truth is..." Tir felt like Ted was hesitating over trying to tell him something important and reminded Ted that they're best friends so he can tell him anything. Ted responded, "Of course, it's just..." He then stalled his words and looked around the room to make sure the others were sleeping. Cleo's voice came out of the darkness, telling Tir and Ted that they've got an early start tomorrow so they better get some sleep. Ted responded, "But Cleo..." Cleo told him she thinks there's something strange going on too, and that Grady and Kanan are definitely up to something, but they don't have any solid proof yet. Ted said okay and gave a sigh as he dove under the covers. He told Tir they can talk anytime. Tir responded, "Alright." Unable to shake off his blue mood, Tir pulled the blankets over his head and tried to sleep, but of course he couldn't fall asleep. Whatever Ted wanted to tell him was on his mind, but even more than that, his mind was filled with memories of people laughing and pointing at the fire and the cries of the townspeople being hunted by the soldiers. And that's the end of chapter 4. You can see why I covered this chapter in great detail. In the game, you showed up at Rockland, you went to Grady's mansion, you had a quick chat with him, and then you went to Mount Seifu. You were in and out in a couple of minutes. But in the novel, the village was under attack from the bandits, Grady and Kanan were taken prisoner, and the group fought the bandits off. It's an entirely new scenario, and we got a better look at how the corruption of people like Kanan and Grady is rotting the empire from within. I think it's a massive improvement over how Rockland played out in the game. Let me know what you guys thought of this chapter. In the next video, I'll cover Chapter 5, which covers the events of Mount Seifu, and that also plays out very differently than it did in the game. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.